Good evening, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to this evening's program. My name is Philip Yun. I have the honor to be your moderator this evening, and I wanted to welcome you to our program this evening on what's going on in North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. First of all, I just wanted to note and thank our co-hosts, the Council of Korean Americans. We have the Executive Director, Abe Kim, who's here. Abe. As full disclosure, I'm also a member of the Board of Directors for CKA, and we're really pleased to have the opportunity to be able to co-host you. So thank you for coming here. They were up in Seattle yesterday, gave a talk, up in Oregon, in Port Eugene, giving a presentation as well. So we're very glad that we were able to work it out where they were able to fly down sort of at relatively short notice when we knew that they were going to get up here to come and speak with us. And it so happens that Kee was just in North Korea, I believe it was in just last month, and then Kathy has been was in South Korea this past October. So it's been certainly, when we think about North Korea, I think about North Korea being a roller coaster. I think it is full employment for people who are North Korea watchers in certain ways. We've had, I guess, the basic roller coaster, up and down, and then up and then down again. If I recall, 2017, did a media audit. I think Abe and some of us and Kathy were all doing a lot of media back then, incredible amount. And it was, if I recall, the buzzwords were fire and fury on the part of our president. And the other piece that I keep on thinking about was whose button was bigger, right? And I think part of it had to do with the fact that Donald Trump was new, and people weren't quite sure what to expect with him as they were going through with all this. And then suddenly, beginning in 2018, with the Winter Olympics in South Korea, things started to change and relations began to warm. We had the South Korean President Moon, who had just become president, starting to push really very hard for some kind of reconciliation with the North. And then suddenly, before we knew it, we had a series of summits, which were kind of unthinkable if you think about it a couple years beforehand. We had two summits with the United States and North Korea in Singapore, and then we had one this past year in Hanoi. There was a DMZ summit in June 13 with President Trump, Kim Jung Un, and Moon Jae-in. And then we saw sort of but as all this was going on, we were hoping to see, and I think the North in certain ways, a lessening of sanctions, but things weren't quite happening as fast as people had hoped. And so now we're kind of on the downhill cycle where we have a deadline, which Kim Jung Un, the grandson, said he wants to see some progress until the end of the year, and I'll be asking them for their predictions related to that. North Korea had a moratorium on missile testing, and since May of 2019, where I think it was in 17 and 18, there were no missile tests. There were very few. Now we had 13 since that time. And then in the last few, in more recent times, we've had rocket engine tests. We have threats of a Christmas gift. We had name calling now, right? Rocket Man and what was it, Doddard? Is that what it is? Heedless. Daughters of a daughter, right. And so it's kind of confusing. And at the same time, we have Donald Trump, who seems to be wanting to be on the good side, trying to maintain a relationship with Kim Jong Un. So to make sense of all this, or to help us make sense of all this, because it is rather confusing, it's complex, and it's rather messy, we have two leading experts to talk about what's going on the Korean Peninsula. And we have, interestingly, I think, is two unique sets of perspectives, very wide-ranging. So we have, for a big-picture policy perspective, we have Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, who's the president and CEO of the Korean Economic Institute in Washington, D.C. KEI is the leading think tank and policy outreach institute, which focuses on promoting greater understanding between the United States and Korea. And then from, I think, really ground level, working actually in North Korea and what's happening from a from personal observations, we have Dr. Kee Park, who's a neurologist, a global health expert, and a surgeon, who is currently the Paul Farmer Global Surgery Scholar at the Department of Global Health and Social Change at Harvard Medical School. So let me just, I think all of you has seen their bios. So let me just go really quickly just to give you a sense of who our guests are. Kathleen Stephens was the former U.S. ambassador to Korea from 2008 to 2011. She was the first woman and the first Korean speaker to serve in that position. Right? I remember the first time I saw you speak Korean. Actually, you had just become ambassador, and I was go, "Wow, pretty good," right? And she's a foreign service officer. I mean, she has had tremendous number of postings, incredible amount of experience, and a very well-known and well-respected senior foreign service officer. And we're lucky to have her here with us. She's had so many different positions. I'm not going to name them, but just let me point out that she was the acting undersecretary for public diplomacy at the State Department and was on the National Security Council for European Affairs. Thank you for being with us here, Kathy. Dr. Park has worked on the ground in Cambodia, Ethiopia, and North Korea. Very easy places to do business, I'm sure. He's also the director of the North Korea program at the Korean American Medical Association, and there he does a lot of collaboration between U.S. and North Korean physicians. He trains Korean doctors, he addresses public health programs in North Korea, and works with international organizations like the WHO to help the country's deteriorating medical and health infrastructure. Interestingly, since 2007, he's made over 20 visits to the DPRK, as I said, most recently this past November. So I think we've got some really great perspectives that we can learn. And so the way we'll do this program in particular, I think I'll sort of ask some questions. And then I think in this point, we're not going to get questions from the audience directly. We'll just have a conversation. It's a relatively small group of people, so we want to try something a little bit different if that's okay with you. So I'll sort of set the table with a lot of different questions, and then maybe that'll spur some questions from you. Then I'll go around, play sort of like go around and like radio host or television host and give you the microphone, and then we'll go from there. All right. Is that all right? So Kathy, why don't we start out with something really basic? Why should we care about what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, and what are you worried about?
Well, I could talk all night about why we should care about the Korean Peninsula, but I'll try to be brief. And I think the fact that you're all here means you care for some reason about the Korean Peninsula. And sometimes younger people will say to me now they care because they've gotten interested in, they've just seen Parasite, or they've, it doesn't have to be younger people, but the movie that's out, if you haven't seen it, you should, or have been introduced to Korea, if you like, through the Korean pop music and popular culture and movies and so on. But also, as you say, I think I've certainly found that the attention to Korea in terms of the perceived threat from North Korea, the fire and fury year, as you referred to it, in 2017. Also, I was living actually here in the Bay Area at the time, and I had very well informed. I'm sure Americans come up to me and say in 2017, "Do I need to worry about nuclear war?" I don't think that's the main reason that we should care about about Korea or the Korean Peninsula, but I do think that the issue, and I know you worked in plowshares for many years on this, the issue of nonproliferation is a very serious one. This year or next year will be the 50th anniversary of the ratification of the Nonproliferation Treaty. I still take those things seriously. I think we should, as a people, as Americans, as world citizens, and the fact that North Korea has, despite many efforts, I guess I'd say best efforts by many years in administrations you've been associated with, I've been associated with, and have continued under the Trump administration, we have failed. We have failed to persuade, coerce, force the North Koreans to turn away from nuclear weapons and to pursue a different path. So that's a serious issue. But I think even more broadly, the Korean Peninsula is geopolitically very important in a time when geopolitics suddenly looms very large. If you think about what the big issues that are going to face, I think, the United States, and again, I guess as a former American diplomat, I'll talk primarily from an American perspective, the big issues that are going to define our futures, the U.S. future, the future of the United States in the world and in our own country. It is the relationship with China. It is, in my view, our ability to address global issues like the environment and climate change and sustainable development. It's our ability to redefine and reshape the rules around the international order, whether it's trade or democracy and values, because I think all of those things are in great question at this time. And in that context, why does the Korean Peninsula matter? There I would point in particular not just to the unfinished business, I would say, in North Korea, both in terms of nonproliferation, in terms of the humanitarian tragedy it represents, but also because of what South Korea represents as a dynamic and like-minded partner and ally of the United States. And I think if the United States is going to have a robust and successful policy to deal with all of these challenges, we need those partners, and we need that relationship. And notwithstanding, and I think we'll probably get into it, or I'd like to mention a little bit, some of the bumps. South Korea can be a bit of a roller coaster ride too when it comes,
Yeah.
and they feel that way too about their relationship with the United States. But notwithstanding the ups and downs of that, that's a very important relationship which needs to be strengthened, not weakened. And that's one of the things, frankly, that I worry about most right now. So I would say right now I worry about the state of our alliances. I think that has a direct impact to our ability to be effective in North Korea. And I would say with respect to North Korea, and again, I don't have a crystal ball or it's very
Sure.
cloudy, but I worry about miscalculation. I worry about blundering into something because we are in a period of new posturing, particularly on the North Korean side, and some uncertainty as we enter 2020.
So let me ask you a question on this, and then I'll go to Kee then. During that period of 2017, when things were really, really tough, and conceivably, some people are worried that we may go back into that phase, in the coming in 2020. Are you afraid of? This is a question that people have asked me. Are you afraid of a preemptive nuclear attack by North Korea?
No, I actually, that would be fairly low on my list of worries. I mean, you could never eliminate anything, and there are a lot of people in the U.S. government, the military, and I'm sure elsewhere who plan for the unthinkable.
Yeah.
But no, as I mentioned, I think my highest worry would be a miscalculation and a misstep that might take place in terms of, if North Korea feels it's going to take the next step. You mentioned that it had not, it had a, if you like, a de facto or almost informal moratorium on nuclear testing and missile testing through the 2017-2018 period. In 2019, after the failure of the meeting in Hanoi between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jung Un to reach any agreement, the North Koreans did begin to test some shorter range, right, mid-range missiles, and now they seem to be towing up to a line, playing a little bit of rinksmanship, which you'd be very familiar with, to perhaps having a satellite launch, or which would be interpreted not just by the United States but by the international community and the UN as a intercontinental missile test prohibited by UN Security Council resolutions, and that might tempt some kind of response or provoke some kind of response from the United States. And again, I doubt that it would be, frankly, at this point, a robust military response. I think that, frankly, the reason that 2017 was so exciting, shall we say, is no one knew what President Trump would do.
Right.
I think now he's probably perceived as a bit more of a paper tiger. Now, I'm not sure if that makes it less risky or more risky,
right.
But I think it makes, again, the chance of miscalculation something that's quite serious.
Okay. Thank you. And then, Kee, you're, as a doctor and a brain surgeon, I think people would be interested to know sort of how you got involved with North Korea and North Korean issues. And I think, also I assume that being Korean American has something to do with this. And why is North Korea important to you, and why should we care?
Yeah, so I work on North Korea at three levels, and I'll explain sort of how I got into all three levels. It was about 15 years ago. I'm Korean American, And I had finished my training. I was in private practice, and there was a number of us who felt like we had sort of arrived in the U.S. We were living very comfortable lives. And we started to wonder if we had a responsibility to do something outside of ourselves. And then we naturally focused on North Korea and saying, maybe we can work with North Korean neurosurgeons and maybe we can support them. So at that time, World Vision, I knew the person who was heading up the North Korea program. He introduced us to two diplomats at the DPRK mission, the permanent mission to the UN in New York. And we met him for the first time. His name was Pak. He's about the same age as I am, with the same last name. We hit it off right away, and then we actually made an invitation to neurosurgeons from North Korea to come to U.S. in 2008, and they did. But then shortly after the invitation went out, we got a call saying, Dr. Park, would you like to go to Pyongyang? And then that was my first trip in September of 2007, and I've been going back twice a year. And we work side by side with North Korean neurosurgeons. We work across the table with them. We operate together. And now we even go out after our surgery and drink and have dinner together, which was not possible at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So I'm an on-the-ground trainer. That's one level. I also work in global health, and Philip mentioned that I worked in Ethiopia and Cambodia. I teach neurosurgery to the locals, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. Realize that the problem isn't more surgeons. The problem is at a system level. And I came back to U.S. and retrained in public health. And so I'm in the Department of Global Health at Harvard Medical School, and we support member states, countries, developing countries, to scale up as they scale up surgical services for the poorest, for the most not at the high tech levels, but really more at the district level hospitals. North Korea is one of the countries that actually signed on to a resolution at the World Health Assembly in 2015, co-sponsored by the U.S., by the way, that called for strengthening essential surgical care at the district hospital level. From my position, we get to actually help DPRK Ministry of Health with their strategic planning and then implementation through WHO connection. And I was just in Pyongyang meeting with the World Health Organization country office and also with the Ministry of Public Health. I don't know if you saw the news just this week or last week, Tongilbu, Ministry of Unification in ROK, announced a $5 million grant to the WHO specifically on this emergency essential surgical care. So it's going to start hopefully next year sometime.
And you're going to be involved in that?
It remains to be seen. Okay. The North Koreans have to say okay to that. And they haven't even said okay to the $5 million proposal yet. They're still going back and forth on that. I would like to be, because we can talk further about that. And a third level is really as a researcher and an advocate. When the sanctions got ramped up 2016, 2017, it was clear it's going to impact the lives of people of North Korea. And I took a personal interest in this and started speaking out in public and became vocal about it and started to do research to look at what is the impact on the people of North Korea. Most recently, our research group that I led estimated the number of people that we think could have died as a result of the sanctions in North Korea in 28 alone with the UN programming, and that number is 4,000. And over 3,000 of that are children under 5 years old. And I think the reason I get to sit in this space with you is probably because of my third engagement, the advocacy and research, because I've become vocal in that. Yeah.
Okay, great. So then let's talk about from your perspective, and then we can ask Kathy. One of the things that, the two questions people ask are, what's the threat? But they also want to know, why is North Korea doing what it's doing? And so I'm sure that, Kee, you've talked with people to some degree about that. You may not have, maybe in some circumstances, people have been fairly direct with you. But what is your sense, from your perspective, from hearing, what is being said in North Korea? What are the reasons why they, what's their perspective on what is happening between the United States and North Korea?
So broadly, not talking about sanctions and what their opinion
let's talk about
broadly.
The big picture. Yeah, why do they want a nuclear weapons program? Why are they being so, in the international community's mind, so provocative?
So this is an excellent question because it allows me to explain what I've perceived, my perceptions of North Koreans. They have an overwhelming sense of paranoia. They live in constant fear of U.S. invasion, whether it's rational or not. I think we can dispute, they can argue that. But I think we underappreciate the level of distrust they have with the U.S. I think that's the first thing we have to appreciate, the level of paranoia. And the other thing is we don't see the balance. Why the North Koreans don't trust the U.S. Mm-hmm. We always think about North Korea is not trustworthy, right? They're not trustable. But there's equal blame to go around on both sides. If you really carefully analyze what happened at, let's say, the Agree framework, why that fell apart, that wasn't a one-sided deal. And that's the one thing that I think we don't appreciate as well.
Okay, so Kathy, for you, when we talk about North Korean intent, I'm curious, sort of drawing on your experience in, being in Seoul more recently, being in Washington, D.C. and talking to people, and then, your interactions. What is your personal assessment in a sense of why North Korea is doing what it's doing? And does that square with what you're hearing and again, there's no monolith in South Korea, there's no monolith in the United States, but is there a pervasive thought about within Washington, in Seoul, about why North Korea is doing what it's doing, and does that square with what you think?
Yeah, those are complicated questions, as you know. I think you do have to put it in a little bit of historical context, which I think is often missing in Washington, where we do have administrations change and officials change. But I think the historical context is well appreciated, or better appreciated, not surprisingly, in North Korea and in South Korea. And to go back of this sense of insecurity, which I think you're really right to emphasize. We're looking at the Korean Peninsula divided, intended to be temporary in 1945 with the surrender of the Japanese, the Korean War in 1950, which was precipitated by a North Korean move south, but was against the backdrop of a desire by all Koreans to be unified, but led to a terrible war, which ended in 1953 with an armistice and not with a permanent peace. And then really the beginning and the freezing of the Cold War, which in a way has continued. So we have a Cold War problem here, but with the end of the kind of sponsoring superpowers. So North Korea in particular started to develop these nuclear weapons because they lost, if you like, the extended deterrence, in a sense, of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. South Korea, just as a matter of historical fact, if you don't mind my making it, is also had a secret nuclear weapons development program in the 1960s and 1970s, which was halted at the insistence of the United States, but not very willingly. There's a sense of great insecurity on both sides, both in terms of the security threat I think they perceive from each other, but also from what they perceive as the great powers of interfering and controlling their destiny. I also think, though, then you talked about the roller coaster of the last couple of years, with North Korea working since the 1970s, in a fairly serious way to develop a nuclear weapon capability. The roller coaster has gotten steeper and steeper and more difficult. The Greed framework, you worked on the issue in the 90s. I worked on it in the aughts with the Bush administration. At that time, they had not yet tested a nuclear weapon. They did not yet have weapons. They have persisted through all that. And it's a long way of getting to your question, why? I think they thought that was a way of ensuring their security, and became more important to them as South Korea became stronger, richer, more prosperous, and again, as they lost the protection of the Soviet Union. That's not a reason. I don't think those are all great reasons, but in a way, they're understandable reasons.
Right.
So part of the effort has been to persuade them that they're better off without them.
Right.
We have failed in doing that. It's much harder now because now they have them. And there's not, as you know well, much history, if at all, of a country that already has nuclear weapons, think India or Pakistan, of saying, you're right. We sacrificed all this, we did all this, and when it gets to the people, and you have the on-the-ground experience, which I don't have, but my impression is you have now the third generation of the Kim dynasty in North Korea with a population that's still very isolated, but they know that South Korea is much richer, much more successful. China is much richer. The world has moved on, and they have been kind of stuck in this isolation. What have they achieved? They have nuclear weapons. They stood up to the world and they protected the world. So I also think that nuclear weapons are a pillar of, if you like, legitimacy for the Kim regime that makes it even more difficult now for them to give it up. So, is that understood sufficiently in Washington and Seoul? I think more in Seoul, yes, than in Washington. And I think in the sense that over the years and when I was ambassador in Seoul and going back and forth, many South Koreans felt, well, the North Koreans are never going to use nuclear weapons against us. They really are a deterrent. They understand if they ever use them, that's the end of them. And I think they do understand that. As you know, the attitude in Washington has sometimes been a little bit different. And I also just think it's purely as a political matter. And this was, I think, the kind of realization of the experience of 2017. Once North Korea started developing the delivery mechanism, right, it's one thing to have a nuclear bomb, and I guess you can have a dirty bomb and put it in a suitcase, but North Korea wants to be a grown-up, mature, right, responsible nuclear power. They want to sit at the top table. This is about prestige, too.
Right.
The top table with the other nuclear power states. And maybe talk about arms control as equals, but not about giving up their nuclear weapons. And once they started to develop the capability to deliver that missile, not just to U.S. bases in South Korea or Japan or to the populations of those countries, but to the continental U.S. as a political matter in the United States, I think then that really changed the political calculation that we cannot stand for this, much almost, and I mean, maybe this is not a proper analogy, but it kind of came to mind here, much as, 9/11, wasn't the first time that Osama bin Laden had killed Americans, but it was entirely different when he did it in the homeland.
Right.
So I think that really changed the way that, and you had the Trump administration too, which is very unconventional, but I think any American administration would have responded in a very, very different and strong way to that. But what we see is we're kind of back to a very familiar scenario for all of us who've been through this of what is going to be if the military option is a bad option. And I think the Trump administration, I can't speak for Mr. Trump himself, obviously, but has seen that it's not as easy as it might look if you're sitting in Washington. What are the alternatives? Are they sanctions? Are they pressure? Are they rewards? Are they recognition? Are they peace treaties? So you get to a menu which is very, very familiar to us, but where the equities and the playing field have really shifted in a way where I think North Korea feels it's in a stronger position.
Okay. So let's switch gears because I'm going to hop along in different places and then we can hopefully get people to respond to some of this. But let's talk about sanctions a little bit. And Kee, you're actually on the ground. I mean, we keep on hearing the rhetoric, both related to Iran and North Korea, about maximum pressure. That's what we're going to do. And there's this discussion generally, I guess there's a theoretical question, do sanctions really make a difference? And so, I guess what I want to ask you are two questions. In your mind, are you seeing sanctions? What are the effects of sanctions actually in your mind on North Korea? Now, let's think about this. I mean, it is, are sanctions, one way to look at it is, are they really having an effect in certain ways? Are they actually materially changing the way people live? And are they really affecting the people's lives who actually are going to make decisions? Are they going to force a change in policy? So I want to get your perspective on what you're seeing on the ground.
Right. So I think we should first tease out what sanctions mean. When we say sanctions, I think we're talking about maximum pressure, coercive measures, and they're multilateral sanctions, UN Security Council sanctions.
Let's talk about economic ones at first, and then well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then there's also the U.S. unilateral sanctions that involves the U.S. Treasury and the Bureau of Industry. And we have to maneuver all these layers for U.S. NGOs, and including the UN and other NGOs. They have to maneuver U.S. Treasury, get permission, and then or get banks to allow transaction of money. I think we have to also look at the impact of sanctions at two different levels. There's clearly a group of, like Pyongyang, for instance, there's a stratus of society that is completely immune to sanctions. Last time I was in Pyongyang, and David Hong is here. He's from Stanford. He's one of my colleagues who goes to Pyongyang with me. There was a row of luxury Japanese and European sedans in this parking lot in front of Nodong Shinmun. So I'm like, wow, where did these cars come from? And I asked the driver.
Shinmun is
It's the North Koreans' the state newspaper.
Yeah.
It was right in front of our hotel, which is the Haebangsan Hotel. We asked the driver, how do they get parts to repair these cars? And he didn't hesitate. He said, we smuggle it in. What do you think? Right? For them, they have a whole system of smuggling in things, but in order to do that, you have to have power. You have to be the elite. So people who are living in the lower part of the socioeconomic strata are not capable of maneuvering through the sanctions. I would argue places like even Ministry of Health, hospitals. There's a hospital that I work at, Pyongyang Medical College, which is their primary teaching hospital. It's the top-level medical school. They had an X-ray machine that we used in the OR. For 10 years, they were able to fix it, and we're using it and using it. Just last May, the machine's broken. So what happened? We can't get parts to fix it. Let's just walk through what they have to do to get a part for this. It's a German X-ray machine. Let's say they have to get a tube. They have to find a vendor that's willing to sell this to a North Korean entity. Good luck with that. Even if you find a sort of a gray market person that's willing to sell it, then you have to be able to have foreign currency, which is in short supply, be able to send the foreign currency outside the country. There are no mechanisms to do that, so you have to hand carry it. Once you procure it, you have to bring it through Chinese customs, and they block anything that has metal, so you have to be able to maneuver that. It's not an easy task, and so the sanctions are having a very little effect on the elites, but a severe impact, I think, on the lower class of the society.
So then from your perspective, I mean, people talk about the fact that sanctions play into the North Korean regime's favor, right? It serves Pyongyang's propaganda interests that they're causing hardship, and it really makes the people more dependent on the government. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I think it's easy to take the sanctions and turn it around and use it as a way to rally people around the government, or rally around the flag effect, if you will. Look, the U.S. is leading these evil tactics, using these tactics to harm us. They're blocking our exports of garments, coal, and seafood. They won't let us import oil anymore. It's easy to demonize us, and then it gets the more legitimacy to the regime, I would say.
Okay. So, Kathy, I wanted to ask, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I just because I think that's a really good point, especially about how a regime can use sanctions to turn any discontent in the country against the outsider rather than against the regime itself. And it's certainly something we've seen in many other countries in the world. And in my career as a diplomat, I've unfortunately or fortunately been involved in a lot of countries where sanctions was the tool that was in the toolbox we used. And from the point of view again of Washington, oftentimes sanctions was picked as an alternative to war.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you pick a sanction, though, especially, it's like, well, we've sanctioned them, we can kind of walk away and almost forget about it. I think it's important to think of sanctions as a means to an end, not an end in itself. And what is the end in itself? The sanctions, and I think that actually the Trump administration's brief has been clear about that, is to get the North Koreans to the table. And to appeal, in this case, and I think there is some logic in this, to appeal to Kim Jung Un's not only stated desire, but I would say pretty evident need and interest in getting North Korea on a different kind of economic footing. Now, to get the economy going in North Korea, you're going to need more than lifting sanctions. You're going to need economic engagement, and I'm not sure how well that's understood in North Korea. But sanctions are kind of a first step, and it's also, I said, a little bit of pressure, hopefully, to get them to the table. But the other thing about sanctions, I say, is a very, very blunt instrument. And again, we've seen that throughout the world. So you're right to sort of, you have to, and this is a more detailed conversation, nuanced conversation, but, one sanction is not like another. And there have to be, in my view, humanitarian carve-outs that really mean it, that really work. It does mean you have to put some pressure on authorities sometimes to have monitors and monitoring in ways they may not like. But that has to be as important as a policy goal as getting them to the table themselves. And finally, I'd say the other thing about sanctions is to try to slow down the development of the weapon systems and so on that are so problematical. But again, it's a very, very blunt instrument. That's true not only in North Korea, but we've seen it, whether it's Iraq, Iran, Burma, former Yugoslavia, we go through it. And I guess my standpoint. And sanctions don't work until they finally do work. At some point, there's kind of a little bit of a tipping point. But I think we've underestimated the resilience and the readiness of the regime and the ability of the regime to withstand that pressure and to not reach that tipping point.
So I want to hold that for a second, but I want to ask Kee, one of the things that you talked about was the impact of sanctions in the studies. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of what the sanctions, the actual effect on the everyday people's lives? I mean,
Sure, I can do that. So I was part of a group of independent experts who generated reports called the human cost and the gendered impact of the sanctions on North Korea. And I'll just highlight just a few things. We talked about the number of people we think died last year. It was 4,000. Let's just talk a little bit about women, because this was commissioned by a women's peace group, by the way. Women make up the majority of the farming workforce in North Korea. When you cut off fuel imports to 10% of what they were previously importing, mechanized farm instruments no longer operate. The fuel gets rationed, and it doesn't go to the farming. So this means it's more work for it's more labor intensive. When sanctions prevent water purification and drill welling in North Korea, people who are primary water gatherers are women, and they have to walk further and longer. And then sanctions do impact the health of the people. For instance, clean water leads to diarrhea, there's malnutrition, other illnesses come on. Who are the primary caretakers of children in North Korea? It's the women. So there are all aspects where women, many aspects where women are disproportionately impacted. And I will just give you one more example of another marginalized population. That's the disabled in North Korea. Handicap International has been there for years. They have an office in Pyongyang. They just announced they're going to pull out. These are advocates for disability rights in North Korea, and they're pulling out because of pressure and banking channels and all the regulatory hurdles. We should not accept these kinds of consequences of sanctions. Every one of these sanctions have written in them, these sanctions are not intended to harm ordinary people of North Korea or hinder the humanitarian aid from going in, but they are. So these measures have to change somehow.
So let me just pull on that just a little bit more. So, you've gone to North Korea, I haven't been there in 20 years, but before that, you've been there 20 times in the space that I haven't been there. But each time you've gone, right, sanctions have been placed on North Korea in some fashion or the other. And yet, have you noticed a difference that things have gotten worse, or have things gotten better, or have they basically been the same? What are you seeing?
So I have to qualify my answer saying all I see is Pyongyang.
Yeah.
And Pyongyang is an anomaly, right? It's immune. The number of taxi companies has grown exponentially. There's probably about a half a dozen or even dozen taxi companies. So there's, and then the number of cars on the road over the last, and we did a report on this, by the way, but we plotted it. It's gone up. There's actually sometimes traffic jams in Pyongyang.
Really?
Yeah.
So, when I was there in the late 1990s, there were no cars. There were just bicycles, right? And now there are traffic jams.
Yeah, they used to have the ladies who direct traffic.
Yeah.
When I went, I stayed at Pyongyang, a Korea hotel, which has a rotating restaurant at the top. You may have stayed there. And they wouldn't turn it on until someone, as a guest, was there. And then they click on the motor to save energy, right? But now, it's rotating all the time.
So how is that happening?
This is a puzzle to me. There's clearly an economy that is not being impacted by the sanctions, and I think it has to do with this massive smuggling, with China. There has to be.
Yeah, I would guess.
So let's talk about China and let's talk about the role. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I do think that kind of, if you like, the moment of maximum pressure on North Korea was sometime in 2017, when not only those of us here in the Bay Area, but in Beijing and Seoul and Pyongyang, no one knew really what this new president, Donald Trump, was going to do. And so there were a lot of very stiff sanctions passed in the United Nations with the cooperation of China on the Security Council. And China, which of course does provide, and first of all, foremost, needed fossil fuels to North Korea, really cracked down and imposed some real pressure. So a number of things probably, and because they weren't sure what would happen if they didn't. With the year of diplomacy and summitry, and Donald Trump, as you mentioned, met with Kim Jung Un 3 times.
Yeah.
Kim Jong Un, after meeting with not a single world leader in the first 5 years of his tenure as leader of North Korea, met with Xi Jinping 6 times. And so China is now providing a backstop for North Korea in, I think, a fairly steady way. So I think that's part of it. But the other part, and I have seen this, I mean, first of all, the North Koreans are very enterprising people. I saw in Yugoslavia in the bad days of the early 90s, I mean, you do empower, if you like, a certain kind of entrepreneurship, which becomes a kind of whack-a-mole. And you develop, economies, Cuba would be another example, that are based on sanctions. And you start using, whether it's chewing gum and string or whatever it is, but you find ways to get things. And so it can have some very unintended consequences. That the other thing, of course, I think has happened in North Korea, and amazing, is that Kim Jong Un, compared to his father and his grandfather, and perhaps out of necessity, has allowed more private markets. I don't want to call them free markets, but private markets. And there has been a certain growth of the domestic market and the domestic economy in North Korea. So I think all of these things have served to keep North Korea from experiencing the kind of, or in the regime itself, the kind of pressure that might have been expected if you're sitting writing sanctions resolutions in New York or Washington.
Okay, so I wanted 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up to folks. So Kee, haven't you going to North Korea so often, I'm sure people ask you a lot of questions about North Korea, North Koreans. We know that we had our own, everyone has stereotypes. I had my own stereotypes before I met my first North Korean and had gone to North Korea as well. If you had to sort of tell, the audience here, what are, a couple of stereotypes that you had or you heard or people ask you about that you found to be absolutely, completely incorrect, maybe it was surprising to you or not. I was wondering if there was something that you wanted to share with us, something related to that. And then while you're thinking about Kathy, I want you to think about as well, I want you to talk about probably what's something very important to you is the U.S.-South Korea relationship and the alliance and what's going on there. So Kee, anything that you...
Yeah, I think one thing I can tell you is that I thought any kind of speaking of democracy was forbidden. And that's just not the case. They're happy to debate with you the benefits and the weaknesses of the democracy and capitalism. So that was that was an eye-opening thing. I was like, can we talk about democracy? Can we talk about capitalism? And say, sure, let's talk about it.
Okay, and then Kathy, for you.
I mean, getting from the perspective of North Korea policy and going back to one of your earlier questions, I think that one thing that Washington doesn't think about, enough, or in my view, in an entirely full way, is, although it gives a lot of lip service to it, is the role of South Korea. And South Korea is a democracy. It changes government. They had a new president who came to power a couple of months after Trump was inaugurated, and as some of you may know, through after many demonstrations in the streets, it led to an early election. But Moon Jae-in, the current president, came to power, and a very high priority of his was to, as it is for every Korean president, I would say, but certainly for him, was to try to see if there could be a thaw in the relationship with North Korea. But first and foremost, not to have a war, because the war would be, directly impact, obviously, South Korea. So it's been a challenging couple of years for South Korea. And with respect to the relationship with the United States, the all-important alliance, it's, South Korea would not be the only ally that has found it challenging and difficult to deal with an American president who came to office with an avowed and decades-long skepticism of the value of alliances, and with a long record, on the record, of being especially critical of troop deployments in South Korea, as well as Japan, and of a view that that allies, especially South Korea as it became richer, are freeloaders. So all these things have kind of created a perfect storm this year, because South Korea and the United States are currently negotiating how much South Korea will pay. It pays something every year, and it's renegotiated every 5 years, but this is the year it's being renegotiated, but how much South Korea will contribute to the cost of deploying what is now about 28,000 U.S. forces in South Korea. And in rather Trumpian style, the ask, at least as understood, widely understood, is to go from roughly $1 billion a year from the South Koreans to $5 billion. Now, you can imagine, politically for the South Koreans, that's very challenging. And there is also the challenge of how do you really count that? So that is combined with also and this divides the South Korean body politic, of a suspicion on the part of South Koreans that underlying this may be a desire on the part of the Trump administration to say, well, you're not going to pay it, we're taking our troops home. Whether because that's a politically desirable from the president's point of view to say, see, I brought American troops home. We're going to let, I'm following through on my promise that our these rich allies are going to look after themselves. Or secondly, is this going to be a part of a deal with North Korea? And how does North Korea see all this?
Mm-hmm.
I can't figure it out.
Right.
And I spend a lot more time in Seoul and Washington, but do they think, is there a possibility that President Trump may actually withdraw troops from South Korea? Could there be a real rupture in that alliance? How does China view that? So, Kim Jung Un's got a lot to think about too, and there are certainly some. I think that we are at a moment where we can't say that the Overton window is widened. We can't say that anything should be out of the question. Yes, South Korea should step up and play a role. We should certainly ask always what is the right sort of alignment of forces, but how does this play out when the Trump administration is also sending signals, which I welcome, that they really do want to negotiate with North Korea and see what's possible? So I would say there's a good deal of unease in South Korea in different ways, depending on where you are in the political spectrum in South Korea, but related to that and also related to the U.S.-China relationship, because we haven't even talked about trade.
Right. So South Korea, as we continue, so Kee, and then we'll open it up after you. So to the extent, I'm curious, I think some of the audience would be curious too, to the extent that, you were interacting with people in North Korea, when they talk about South Korea, how do they talk about South Korea?
That's an interesting question. It's clear that the North Koreans calibrate their reactions to the South Koreans in a much different way. They have a much different standard.
Sure.
I think they have an expectation that South Korea should act independent of U.S. and they see how the alliance is in play, so much so that the South Koreans are not acting in any independent fashion. And I think it's a source of frustration and a source of kind of a criticism, if you will, saying you're not being strong. You should be more bold in your stance.